Okay, I think we've got everyone turned off.
Great.
Hopefully.
Okay.
I will switch the chat to host only, so it doesn't keep popping up for you. But everyone can still put questions in it for you for the end.
Great.
They'll just go to me, that's all. And any tech issues will come to me as well.
Okay, so welcome everybody to this afternoon's talk about wildlife gardening. And as I've explained to a few people, my name is Anna Williams. I am based in Bangor in our office in Northwest Wales, and I cover Gwynedd, Conwy and Anglesey. And my work is mainly about engaging people and communities and creating habitats and also bringing people to our nature reserves. So I worked with plenty of schools over the last 15 years, helping them to create wildlife-friendly gardens, and also community groups that are interested in improving their spaces for wildlife. So if you professionally or out of interest fall into any of those groups, you can always contact me there. There's my email address. Sometimes we have various programs, like at the moment we've got a local climate change action program where I'm going to work with 16 schools actually, helping them to create wildlife friendly gardens and also allotment gardens over the next year. So for those of you who don't know about the Trust, the Wildlife Trust is a countrywide organization. So for those of you who don't live in North Wales, you can look up your own branch where you live. And it's a membership organization. So everywhere we're very keen to have members because that supports our work. And also, of course, you can find out about what we do. Whether you're a member or not, you're very welcome to come and volunteer for us. And we are actually still going out doing work on our reserves, and that is allowed even now during lockdown. So on the website, you can find out about events, volunteering, membership, and about the different reserves. So we manage 36 reserves in North Wales. Okay, I think that's about all. You can ask more about the Trust at the end. So wildlife gardening. Gardens are very important habitats in urban areas, forming what we call green corridors. And the size of all the gardens is not insignificant. It's actually 3% of total area and 4,850 square kilometers. And of course, this is actually a bigger area of land than what we have in our 3 national parks. Sorry, I meant to move something else. And so it's a huge area. We haven't got sort of designation for it, of course, but all of us can do our best to create our own nature reserves, and wildlife knows no boundaries. So whether you have rare species in a garden or a wildlife reserve, you know, that's in a way irrelevant. It's the habitats that are important. So many gardens are absolute havens for wildlife. And as you can see in these 2 photos, there's a big difference. And sadly, the trend has been over the last, I don't know, 10, 15 years to tarmac front gardens for car parking or decking them over or graveling them over. And I could see that in my own village. There's a lot of lovely front gardens, suddenly seems to have disappeared. And in this garden here, this is fantastic cottage garden done on a sort of square meter patchwork basis. And of course, even in that small area, plenty of plants, and she was growing vegetables and herbs here. So what is wildlife friendly gardening? It's obviously gardening with nature in mind. So in everything you do, you just maybe stop and think, why am I doing this? Or is this necessary? Am I doing this at the wrong season for wildlife? Are the birds nesting? And that's of course important now. Birds are starting to nest, so we mustn't disturb hedges and shrubs and bushes. So it is taking a little step backwards and thinking, about the whole process. So simply how you can attract wildlife. Every wildlife garden needs shelter, both obviously physically for the wildlife, because if you imagine you're a butterfly and you come in and land on a flower, if it's blowing 40 miles an hour, it's a little hard to hang around in there. So create shelter, so then when you're planting your nectar-rich borders or whatever you're doing, you will get the pollinators. Food, of course, that can be in forms of the plants that you plant. I think that's easiest. Obviously, we can feed birds and so on. Water, really is a huge and important addition to any garden. It doesn't need to be a pond. It can be obviously bird baths, bog gardens, or smaller features like a stream or whatever you might have. It's about creating different habitats, but it's absolutely no need to look wild. That's a kind of myth in a way. And I'm sure you might have seen some of those programs on telly where they're actually showing some of the gardens that just been left and all there is bramble and nettles. They're not necessarily, they usually know better than a garden that is managed for wildlife, where you make an effort to have different shrubs or plants that are attractive to birds and insects. So I'm going to go through the habitats one by one. And I have split, if you noticed, there's a talk today, there's a talk on the 25th of March. So today I won't really cover the pollinators and the pollinator plants, because that's a whole, that's enough for another talk. I thought it would get a bit too long. So hedges though, I'll start talking about shelter. It's great if you can plant a mixed native hedge, and I'm going to suggest a few plants that are good. I definitely think that any of these hawthorn, blackthorn, hazel, cherries, and you can throw in a crabapple or two. And again, put in maybe an elder that will go to flower, and then you got the flower and later the berries. Field maple is a traditional hedge plant. Spindle is more rare these days. And I don't know if you're familiar with Guelder rose. I will show a picture later, but that's a very beautiful shrub come tree. So if you leave it, it will have nice flowers and then great berries for the birds. So here are a few ideas. And of course, when you plant a native hedge, you can do a single row or a double row. You might have heard about that. Here, I think it's a double row. And here in the countryside, it's fenced off from the sheep. So it's very important that you protect it from sheep or rabbits, and actually also from grass. So what I tend to do, I tend to put a mulch at the bottom. Here, just to show you, a thick blackthorn hedge. Hedges that are thick at the base with a variety of trees are really the best for wildlife. And of course, soon the blackthorn will start flowering, which I think is one of the beauties of the early spring season. The blackthorn, the flowers come out before the leaves. I like the hawthorn. Hawthorn, the leaves come out first and the flowers come out at the beginning of May. It's also known as maythorn. So blackthorn, of course, we get the sloes, and they are great for birds afterwards, and of course for people as well. You can make sloe cordial or sloe gin, which are both very delicious. So more native plants, holly, of course, for an evergreen. Some more unusual plants these days, wild service tree and wayfaring tree. They were both more common in our hedges in days gone by. It'd be great to reintroduce them. It's always nice to throw in some wild roses, dog rose, honeysuckle, and if you've got wet ground, dogwood is very good, cornus. Actually, the next few are also good for a wet area, willow and alder, they will grow well. And they all can be treated like a hedge and cut back every year to bush out to make a nice fat hedge. And I put oak in there. Traditionally, people used to leave a few trees growing tall. And if you had an oak tree in the hedge, you might leave it to grow tall, and that then become a standard, a big tree, which oaks are very good for wildlife and they attract about the most wildlife, I think, in Britain today, of all trees. Not that it's a competition, they're all good, but if you have oaks on your land, do look after them. People ask me about evergreen hedges. Of course, yew, holly, box. Griselinia is not native. I haven't grown it myself, so no experience of that. And then beech, and the beech is not really evergreen. You've probably seen that they hold on to their leaves through the winter. So even if you walk out today, the beech hedge looks quite full with the brown leaves. Privet is a good plant if you let it flower. That's here down on the bottom right. The flowers are strongly scented and very popular with moths and then bats as the night flying animals. Of course, we are not completely purists saying you have to go native. It's also fine in your gardens. You can do what you want, and these plants are very good for wildlife. Top right is an escallonia, and they can form fantastic hedges, very pretty as well, with the flowers through pink to white to crimson. Top left is a pyracantha or firethorn, and that is again a very nice hedging plant, especially good if you don't want people to walk through it or livestock, because it's very prickly. Bottom left we got berberis, and bottom right we got fuchsia. Fuchsia hedges are commonly seen in seaside areas because they are very tolerant of sea spray. So in Ireland, Devon, Cornwall, you might see fantastic fuchsia hedges. And it's definitely something you may think about yourself if you are planting a hedge. It doesn't need to be tree plants as such. These are more what I would think of as shrubs. Lavender and dogwood also make very attractive hedges. So sadly, since the Second World War, we've lost 160,000 kilometers of hedges due to intensive farming. They were grubbed up to make it easier for tractors and I suppose bigger vehicles to fertilize and plow the fields. But I think now we realize that that is a great loss to our biodiversity and to species variety and numbers of individual animals as well. So decline of wild bees, hedgehogs, birds, etc. The hedges sort of forms a very important, should say, patchwork in our countryside, and they help with what's known now, trendy word, ecosystem services. They help us to, because they bind the soil, they stop erosion, and certainly in Mid Wales there's been a problem with that in some of the uplands there, which has been so intensively farmed. So hopefully now people are starting to plant more hedges, but it is also what I said before, it's not just a matter of planting hedges or planting trees, you've got to look after them. You've got to make sure that the grazing animals can't get them, and also that the grasses, once you planted a new hedge, for the first 2 or 3 years, I mentioned the mulch. It's good to put thick mulch of sawdust around the base of the trees. You can put a weed membrane, or if you rather, you can put cardboard and plant around your plants and then put the wood chip there. So make sure that you look after your trees. And I mean, in no time at all, you have a thick hedge. I was just visiting a school 2 days ago just to check up how it was going, and it's really satisfying to see them. Because normally I plant just little whips, and they are planted as varied plants. And we were in our middle of March. You still got another couple of weeks maybe to get those in if you're thinking of doing a hedge. But of course you can also buy potted hedge plants, and they can be planted right through the spring. Although the sooner the better, because when you're coming into summer, there's a lot of watering that you need to do. So just showing you some examples. I mentioned this weed membrane, and we make a slit, and you do what's called slit planting. You can just stick your spade in and put your plant in at the back of the spade. And here we're protecting them from rabbits and from the strimmers. In many areas, in public areas, it's the brush cutters, the strimmers, that are the biggest threat actually. Once, of course, the tree has been ring-barked, that's it. So here was a project. We put down 30 meters in a day along that fence. And again, the school needed some protection from very strong winds high up in Rhiwlas and Gwynedd. And the boys are putting in these tree guards around each tree. And I out of curiosity, this is a few years ago, 3-4 years ago. And now these are mostly willow and alder because it was like a swamp. The trees are reaching above that fence at the moment. So I suggest to the school they can start cutting it to let it bush out. This is a great thing to do in a school. Good teamwork, everybody helping, and you achieve something substantial, good for wildlife and good for the yard afterwards, really. They're creating a more sheltered place for play. Hedges, of course, provide both shelter and food. I think all of these hedges have birds nesting in them, and the bottom left is in a school, and it's great when I visit schools and the children are telling me, showing me exactly where the blackbirds are nesting, and they're very careful about it. They wouldn't disturb, but again, they take that ownership of their garden and notice the local wildlife, which is really what it's all about. So here it looks like some hawthorn with berries, and down on the clean, very strong salty winds. And this couple, certainly the first thing they did when they moved in there and they had a big field, it was to plant a double width hedge. And here you can see they've let it grow, so that'll be very good for wildlife. And then they've got a meadow inside it. They were lucky. This meadow is absolutely full of orchids. So we'll talk about that in a minute. Oh yes, so what I wanted to do, I'll just show you a little film from just above my house of these animals flying along a hedge at dusk. know. Right, so we all know it's a bat. I don't know, I didn't have a bat detector, but it's a fairly large one. I wouldn't be surprised if it was a long-eared bat. And it came so close to myself and my daughter, it was amazing. I thought, I wondered if its echolocation had gone wrong, but it did, anyway, it didn't hit us. I've never been that close to a flying bat before. So, and that was flying alongside this mixed hedge, feeding on insects, plentiful. All the insects, which I suppose we don't notice, but they are there. And they will be there because they get food from the hedge and shelter. So different types of boundaries. This is a creative hedge. We made it out of some willow, which I had left over from a willow dome I made in a school. And if you like the look of that, it was actually very successful. It was the first time I did it, and I was surprised how well it worked. But you have to make deep holes. So we made holes with a trussel, a crowbar, about 1 foot deep. And then you poke the stems in and bend them over and put the tip in. So that now is the hedge here down on the bottom right. And that is, we just treat that management as a normal hedge. Just cut it with shears. And it's working rather well. In the beginning, we were weaving branches in, but I think now it's just fine if you just chop them back. Once you get willow established, it's a pretty tough plant. And it's also kind of nice. You don't always want a really high hedge. And certainly here, there's a school field on the other side, and it's nice if people can still look into the garden, so we're not blocking that off. Here's another type of willow fans, and I love this little seat within a stone wall. So going on to stone walls, they are excellent habitats for wildlife. It's kind of obvious because you've got the crevices and the birds will nest in there. I've had robins, redstart actually nesting on the back of a stone building. And that was, I haven't seen it the last few years, but it used to come. You can, of course, also see shrews and voles and small invertebrates. And if you have one, why not plant on top of it? Just increasing the amount of plants and habitat you have. So trees, choice of trees will depend on your size of garden and obviously the size of space. So always think about that when you're choosing a tree. So for a smaller garden, I personally love rowan trees, beautiful flowers and berries, and the birds love them too. Silver birch is popular as well with birds. They come and sit and eat the seeds later on. Cherries, of course, are good for people and wildlife. This is a lovely big wild cherry tree, which was donated by Gwynedd Council. I thought it was a nice idea when one of my sons was born. So that's now 23 years old. And I do like those kind of initiatives, you know, celebrate events, or if I give presents to my friends, they tend to get a tree. Or fruit trees are very good, obviously, apple trees. This is a little oak forest, started from acorns. So again, that is something fun to do in the autumn, collect acorns in your local woodland and then bring them on yourself and plant them to increase the amount of trees we have. So I think we can all help there by planting if you have the space. I mentioned Guelder rose, that's the tree up top left, and crab apples I mentioned too. Crab apples, they come in all different varieties, absolutely stunning foliage. They can be darker red and then also lovely, lovely blossom. So if you're thinking of one plant for pollinators and you have room for a tree, do go for a fruit tree, because then you really will maximize the benefit. Rowans and elder. So elder, I mentioned before, we've got this lovely white flower with a rather, leaves have got a rather pungent smell, and so has the bark of the tree, if you've ever smelled it, or the branches. The branches are hollow inside, and the elder was it was feared by the devil. So if you didn't want the devil to come into your house, you planted an elder by your front doors. And of course, it's great for the foragers of us. And I think I will have, yes, here we are. You can make fantastic elderflower cordial, and I do it every year. It's very popular. It seems like every other Swede do that in the summer. And of course, you could try elderflower champagne as well. And then make some crab apple jelly. Absolutely delicious. And I think it's great to carry on these traditions. So from your hedges or your trees, you can do quite a lot of foraging and then turn that into food, jellies, drinks. So orchards. You might all have fruit trees, I don't know, but this is, I think, is one really good plant to plant with schools, because even if they are neglected, they do seem to survive. So here, I was out in Pennygroes, that was this autumn, and it's a great little project for the kids to do. We make these wooden boxes to put around the trees, and that again is something that you might not do in your own garden, but what you should think about is to keep the grass down around the base of a newly planted fruit tree. And certainly my colleague Ewan noticed a massive difference when he kept the grasses down or low with mulch around the fruit trees. as opposed to when there was big competition with grass all around the tree. And of course, if you let the grass grow long and then somebody comes with a strimmer, it's so tempting to go really close to that tree to cut the last blade of grass, and then you might have it all ring-barked, and that's bye-bye to your lovely apple tree. So plant them just to show, and keep a tab on what you plant. There's a huge amount of variety on the market. And actually, I did give a talk just purely about trees and apple trees. So, and there are lots more varieties there. You can find that film on YouTube channel, on our YouTube channel. So from planting a tree, it's important to go the whole way to death and decay, and do leave some logs or branches that you are cutting back in your garden. Certainly for many of us who can't have bonfires, and it's great then to make habitat piles of your branches, of your logs, and they slowly break down, and they are benefiting invertebrates, fungi, and mammals, of course. You have the hedgehogs coming in and out of these log piles. And of course, if you have children, they're great places to do bug hunts. Just turn up the stumps and you have a whole host of slugs and snails and beetles, millipedes, centipedes. So great places to go and explore. Meadows. Again, I have given a talk only on meadows. If you want a lot more information, you can go and find that on our YouTube channel. But I will mention the basics anyway. So how can I create what we call a wildflower perennial traditional haymeadow? Option 1, just leave the grass to grow and see what comes up. If you haven't got very many flowers in there, you can plant plug plants, and I'll show a picture of that. If there's another option, if your area is maybe not too big and you feel like you want to start completely from scratch, you have to remove the turf and so you can sow seeds on the bare soil. Or you can do what's called scarifying the sward, and that's removing about 2/3 of the grasses in the sward by raking, or if you've got a field, you do it with a harrow. And then you add your seeds onto that. So you've already got some grass left, but then you add wildflower seeds. What you can't do, and what people do waste their money on, is to put wildflower seeds straight onto a lawn. They need soil to be able to germinate, and then also to be able to compete. So if it's really, really dense grass, the wildflowers are struggling. And for all of these, once you have your meadow, you need to cut and remove your hay at least once per year. And that will be once the flowers have set seed, and usually end of July, although if you have a lot of black knapweed, that will be later on. So say August, September. That's entirely up to you when you cut it. Just show you a few examples. So here we got a patch with lovely white clover, which is popular with honeybees, short-tongued bumblebees as well, and other solitary bees, leafcutter bees. They will also come and have a little feast on the nectar from the white clover. And here the owner of this garden has put out various homes for solitary bees and other small creatures within the wall. The important thing is for any of these solitary bee homes is to have them south facing with an open, I suppose, flight path. Here we are planting some plug plants, and this is a communal project, as it happens, opposite one of our nature reserves, opposite Hedges Nature Reserve. And the Housing Association approached me and asked how we could make this area a little bit more interesting. Because there's a lot of green grass around housing associations properties, and usually the only management is just to cut it hard. And at least these people who got together thought it's not very interesting, and they wanted to change it. So I bought, I don't know, a couple of hundred of plug plants, and here we are planting them into the sward. we are trying to do, I think it's best to plant a little clump, maybe 3 plants, take away the turf, and then put maybe 3 plants in. And having cut the grass short beforehand, obviously. So that worked well, I think. You get a meadow full of pollinators when we were visiting. And later on, especially these black knapweed, are very popular with goldfinches. So I came another day and there was a flock of goldfinches sitting in here feeding. And of course, before we did this, there wouldn't have been any food for any birds. So little by little, we can improve our urban areas as well and create habitats for wildlife. And obviously we have to do what we preach. And here we're making a meadow in our office garden in Bangor. Oh, and yeah, there it is. It was very successful, just that little strip, I don't know, 4 meters by 3 meters. And it's hundreds of flowers in there, a lot of food for pollinators, and also just a joy to look at. And it was interesting, we do have, there's a student housing to the side of us, and I did have a student volunteer who joined us on one of our work parties, and she did say that she really enjoyed watching the meadow from her window. So that's a benefit for people as well as wildlife. Right, okay, you can have a little quiz for yourself. I'm not going to have an official quiz, but I'm just popping in a few plants that are good for your meadows. That's a bird's foot trefoil, excellent food plant for common blue butterflies, burnet, moths, etc. There's actually a bee coming into land on that photo. I only saw the bee after. Field scabious. This one I mentioned, that's the black knapweed. The knapweeds are very good, and they are a traditional meadow plant. Certainly the bird's foot trefoil and black knapweed are one of the indicator species for semi-natural neutral grassland. So you'll expect to find them in a decent meadow. We've got some ladies' bed straw, which was used, as the name says, as straw for bedding. And you probably all know that one, red clover, and that one, meadow buttercup, but you can't take it for granted. Everybody says, oh, everybody knows a buttercup, but a lot of children I work with, they don't know. So it's good to go out and just talk about flowers, learn a few names. That one is called a meadow cranesbill. I find it very, very attractive. Oxydaces. And once you got them, they spread really well all around your garden. This little plant called a self-heal. It looks very similar to a plant called bugle. Both of those are common in meadows, and they are, I suppose, considered as weeds. But for us, they are not weeds. They are very important wildflowers. That's a yarrow, popular with beetles later on. A lot of the umbellifers get absolutely inundated by garden beetles and different types of beetles. And last but not least, the yellow rattle. And the yellow rattle is a hemiparasitic flower, which means that it parasitizes grasses, which makes them weaker. That is a good thing, because then there is more space for the wildflowers to grow, because it's all about competition within your meadow. Competition for space, competition for the soil, obviously. And our wildflowers, they are happy to grow in a low nutrient soil. That's what they prefer. Whereas the grasses, obviously, they take off. Once you put fertilizers on, the grasses really take off. And then they will outcompete your flowers. So for meadows, you can be very successful in an area which has almost got no soil. You know, it can be very rocky, gravelly, poor nutrient status with the wildflowers. As long as they've germinated, they will be happy. And of course, if you go and buy wildflower seeds, do look carefully what type of soil you've got. You can do pH tests. You can, choose, is it sandy soil? Is it clayey soil? Is it acid, alkaline, neutral? So there are a few things you can check out first. And I think actually after this talk, I'm about to order some wildflower seeds for my neighbor. He's planting a strip, and it's not too late to sow them now. It was incredibly cold very recently, so I'm glad I hadn't got them in beforehand because he wasn't ready with the land. But I think in the next 2 weeks, we're going to sow it. That's absolutely fine to sow your meadows now. Alternatively, you sow them in the autumn, which I think is probably a better time of year to sow them. And traditionally, obviously, the plants lose their seeds in autumn, and then they've got the whole winter to germinate. And some plants, like yellow rattle, actually needs a good frost in order to be able to germinate. So you probably, sometimes there's a bit of confusion between meadows and what is actually an annual cornfield mix. And these annuals are cornflowers, corn cockle poppy, corn marigolds. And again, you can sow them in the autumn or spring, but because they are annuals, they need reseeding every year. This was rather late in my book, November. I wasn't sure if it was too late, but it did work. And in June next year, we had this amazing display of flowers. And the cornflowers, so they are usually seen as a weed alongside arable fields. But with intensification of farming and more herbicides used, they are actually becoming very rare in the landscape, and it's not that often you see them anymore. So cornfield mix in a garden adds a great splash for a year. But then at the end of the year, what you need to do is you need to pull the plants out. And if they've set seeds, you can shake the seeds on the ground where they were before, and they will come again next year. Or you could collect the seeds, clear the area, and then sow the seeds. So yeah, I mean, it's the same thing, but it just depends how you go about doing it. So that's a cornflower, the blue one with a red-tailed bumblebee on it. They are one of my favorite flowers. And if you get them established, they're absolute beauty in your garden. So from meadows and wildflowers to ponds, and adding water to your garden usually adds a bit of drama and excitement. Many people tell me that that was the sort of cherry on the cake in their wildlife-friendly gardens. You don't have to have a totally sunny spot, which some people advocate you do, but of course you would want to avoid putting your pond under a tree because you get far too many leaves in it. So yeah, location is important. Think of all the leaves that might fall into it in autumn. We are trying to have different types of plants in the ponds, floating plants, oxygenating plants, which are in the water, and then the marginal plants, which are along the side of the pond. Unfortunately, no goldfish or carp in your wildlife pond because they will have a good feast on tadpoles, newts, etc. Although I know some people, if you've got a massive pond and quite a lot of shelter for your amphibians, then they might survive in decent numbers. But normally we'd say no fish in a wildlife pond, apart from stickleback, the little sticklebacks. You want at least one side of the pond to have a gently sloping edge for easy access. So birds, they obviously hop into the pond and they'll sit and wash themselves. So either they can sit on some rocks or, you know, just low rocks within your pond. And say a hedgehog's coming to visit, again, they'll come in to drink, but we don't want hedgehog to fall into the pond. Though they can swim, but they do definitely need to have an exit strategy there. So make sure it's friendly for mammals and birds. As far as pond goes, this is where I definitely would say only native plants. No aliens, no New Zealand stonecrop. Crassula is a complete disaster in our landscape. Very, very invasive. A lot of the water plants, even native, are quite invasive. But so anything Canadian pondweed, don't use it. Anything with a foreign country's name, don't use it, because actually we need to be responsible gardeners, and those plants have spread into the wider countryside, and NRW is spending hundreds of thousands of pounds clearing water courses and ditches because of these alien pond plants. So be sensible and responsible. And these people here, this pond, you can see in the bottom photo, is quite impressive because they lived on a slope just outside Garreg, very mountainous, but it didn't stop them from having a pond. So they first built a massive stone wall and then filled up the pond. So good effort. Ponds are hugely important for our amphibians, toads, newts, the different types. That's a palmate newt, and you can see the back foot there. It's got a slightly webbed foot, the palm there. Frogs, and in the past, before pumped water, there would have been a lot of natural ponds in our landscape, again out in the wider countryside. But with pumped water and more efficient farming, these ponds weren't looked after or needed, I suppose. And there, I think they reckon about 75% of natural ponds were lost again in the last 50 years. So a lot of habitats, wild habitats, have been lost fairly recently since the Second World War. And of course, gardens have been a refuge, and garden ponds are incredibly important for these amphibians. So I'm just going to show you a few examples. This is an outdoor centre, and again, I suppose a workplace and a place where children come. Not at the moment, sadly, but somewhere where they can come and explore. And a place like this will have amphibians coming very quickly. You can see this is a well-designed pond. You put stones around the edges in places, logs, long, tall marginal plants around the edges, and a few floating water lilies there. This pond, another amazing feat. So even if you just have a garden with concrete front or back garden, you can still make a pond if you're nifty with the stones. So these people made a stone wall, put the liner in, and then planted it up. So I think that's excellent pond in a different setting. Here you can see it, a town garden. So a few plants. These are on our website, so if you haven't got time to write them down, go and check out our website. It's a wildlife gardening page with pond plants. Milfoil, crowfoot, curly pondweed, and floating plants. Of course, water lilies. For water lilies, plant them in pots because they very quickly take over, as you will see in a film shortly. Around the pond, the beautiful marsh marigolds, which are soon flowering, the yellow iris, purple loosestrife, water mint. There's plenty to choose from. And as I mentioned before, pond plants quite often grow very vigorously. So you have to maintain it. You have to weed a pond. And I think maybe we forget about that. You have to treat it like a border. So once it's established, depending on the growth, obviously, in your pond, every 2 to 3 years, you'll take out so much of the plants so that you keep having a little bit of open water. And that's entirely up to you how much you do it. I'll just show you some pictures on how we made a pond at home. Dig a hole. This one was so big, so we got a mini digger in. Then put a liner in, and under the liner, you can put an underliner or sand or old carpets, whatever you got. Here we got a liner, and we're actually putting a little bit of this underliner on top of the liner as well, because I wanted to put sand in, otherwise I figured it would just slide off the shiny liner. 2 tired boys fill it up with sand. And here I've made some habitats. It's a good idea to have rocks and a little bit of interest, shelter for newts and frogs to go and hide under, and a more shallow area here. A pond doesn't need to be massively deep, but this one is no more than 2.5 feet in the middle, 60 centimeters, maybe 70. So it's not important. And here's finished. It's always hard to cover the liner, but we used the turf that we dug up, and in one place I put a bit of wildflower turf. And here's purple loosestrife I mentioned before. And then it grows. And of course, yeah, plenty of flowers, plenty of wildlife. My children thought it was a bit too wild, but I will show you who's benefited. This year, we had the most enormous amount of frogs. And this is only about 3 weeks ago. I went out in the garden one morning, and I will show you a little film here of the amorous amphibians. Hang on, here we go. So if you had good audio, you could maybe hear the frogs croaking, the males fighting for the poor female. There must be at least 4 or 5 males on top of the female. And we thought she was dead. She looked completely dead, but she did swim away. So hang on. And the result is this absolute sea of frog spore, just to see the scale of it. And interestingly, as the books and advice tells you, they do like to lay the frog spawn away slightly more shallow. This is my nursery bed, and almost half the pond is now full of frog spawn. We were very kind during the cold spell. I went outside and put some matting I had, or I think it's like environmental fleece, put some bits of wood across and then put that over and held it down. And it actually saved quite a lot of frog spawn from freezing and turning white. So plenty of frogs in that pond. And I must say, it's really exciting if you go out either early morning or late at night. And I came out one evening with a head torch and I just looked in, I thought, what on earth is that? And all the frogs, I don't know if I startled them with a light, but they were like hanging like this, arms up, as if I wasn't going to see them. And it was such a comic sight. It was about 10 of them. I think they might have been, well, probably both male and females, hanging out, waiting to mate. I'm going to show you another little film of, because I love this film, of creatures that are benefiting from the pond. So this is, of course, in spring. This is my own filmage, so it's not David Attenborough style, but I managed to catch them here. So you can see the damselfly. There's a male that's holding on to the female, and the female is putting her ovipositor into the water, laying eggs on plants. And it's fascinating to see how they fly around, landing on little bits of vegetation. And there was about, at least 10 different pairs, if not more, laying eggs all at the same time. And here you can see, I think this is an azure damselfly. It looks similar to the common blue damselfly. And that's the area of my pond, which, as you can see, I got a lot of water lily. So this last winter, I went inside my pond and reduced the amount of water lily there, because as I said, they will take over. So a bit of management is needed. Oh, right. If you haven't got a big size garden, you can make a pond just with a little pot. And we were amazed to find that we had newts that had laid their eggs in this little pond. And the teacher was very excited, and they were pond dipping with the children. Some ponds go to great lengths and do bigger ponds. Right, so from ponds to birds, I suppose there's three different main topics today. Obviously, it's good to have a variety of food. I find that putting out apples at the moment is really popular with the blackbirds and the thrushes, as you can see here. Song thrush, missel thrush, and blackbirds, they love eating apples on the ground. It's important to clean your bird feeders regularly. And of course, if you're interested, you can take part in the BTO Garden Birdwatch. That's great fun. We did it in the office when we were working from here regularly. So, and in this town garden in Bangor, we actually have 32 different species of bird. And I suppose it helps that we've got a lot of specialist people here, and sometimes you just hear the song rather than seeing the birds. This squirrel, not sure if he got out after a meal in there. So obviously, think of how to deter the squirrels by using squirrel-proof bird feeders. This was only a couple of weeks ago in my garden. I love these long-tailed tits, very elegant. They usually come in as a flock, and the high-pitched song, and then they were all feeding on the fat balls. This funny thing in the front here, you can see, you used to fill this up if you want to make your own mixture of lard and birdseed, and then you can drill holes in a log and then stuff them with that rich lardy, fatty mix, and the birds will come and eat it, and the woodpeckers quite like it too. I find the woodpecker actually comes on our seed feeder as well as another one of those fat ball feeders, not that one. That's showing their long tails. So what can we do? Of course, we can build bird boxes. Maybe that's something you've done. And if you haven't done it, it's not particularly difficult. From a plank of wood, whether you work in inches or centimeters, you can knock up your own box. So you can have different size holes. The smaller holes, you can attract blue-tit, grey-tit, coal-tit, tree sparrow and pied flycatcher, and also slightly bigger holes, the house sparrow and the nuthatch. I reckon that some of the boxes I have at home are probably, the hole is probably somewhere in between the two, which is fine. And I've been very pleased to have had both nuthatches, which I think you'll see. Oh yeah, here. They are not that common in our bird boxes, and they made a nice bit of filling here in the gaps, because that's, I suppose, what they would do in the tree. They collect mud and then they cement it on there like a good filler. And they were fantastic to have in your bird box. And the following year we actually had, last year we had pied flycatchers. So yeah, you don't know what you're going to get. Put a few up, and it's very important to put this, I think it's useful to put this metal plate in front of the hole, because that will stop both squirrels and the greater woodpecker to enlarging the hole, and the boxes will last that much longer, because they will enlarge the hole and then predate on the chicks. We've got, there's a website, wildlifewatch.org.uk, and there are lots of these activity sheets. So it's not just for children, for yourselves or anybody, but there's plenty to do with children as well on that website. So Song of Spring. So that's a song thrush, which repeats its song. Maybe not amazing, but anyway, I thought it was a lovely little bit to bring in. So you might have heard them now in your gardens, busy defending their territory. Of course, it's only the males that are singing. This garden is excellent for birds. There are lots of different habitats, hedges within the garden, places where the birds can shelter and feed. So, variety of habitats. Bats. I think if you have the ingredients that I've mentioned before in this talk, and you add some night-scented flowers, you've got your hedges and your trees, you leave an area unmown from May onwards, mow-free May, have a pond, reduce your lighting and keep your cats indoors. You might be lucky to get bats in your garden. They are good indicators of a health of our environment. And it's not a bad thing to have bats living in your roofs, because very often they go in under the soffits and they hang out in here. And some people think that's horrible, but it's not. They actually eat woodworm beetles. So they're a good animal to have in your roofs. If you want to make a bat box, you can have a look at this later. This is called a Kent bat box. You have little slits here where the bats can go in, and then they hang in these small spaces between the bits of wood. So the hole here is ever so thin, only about max an inch wide, between half an inch and an inch wide slits. That's something we can also make and put up. They need to go high up in trees, so high up on houses, and have an open flight path. The same as actually as birds, I should have mentioned that. Yeah, put your bird boxes where they have an open flight path and where you don't think the cats can get them, or people for that matter. Just quickly talk a little bit about kitchen garden. I know it's not strictly speaking wildlife gardening, but the compost actually has the most different types of species in your garden. So if you're after a number of species, get some specialists in to have a look in your compost. You can, best to do a mix of greens and browns, kitchen waste, and then the browns are the cardboard, scrunched up newspaper, straw. And some people get the compost going very quickly. I mean, for me, it takes a year to get it. It's not particularly warm here. The warmer you have the compost, the quicker it goes. So if you add actually layers of animal manure and freshly cut grass, the compost heats up and the process of breakdown goes faster. Always good to have two bins, one that's active and one that's decomposing. You can make them very cheaply with pallets. And you might have these visitors. That is a garden in Criccieth, and those are grass snakes. So she was very chuffed to have grass snakes in her compost. So look out and be happy if you got them. I would obviously say, if you're going to grow veg, it has to be organic. To me, if you're doing your own food, you wouldn't want to put chemicals on it. And it's very important, as you probably know, in organic principles, to look after the soil. Healthy soil, healthy plants, and then you shouldn't need to interfere or do things. And then use physical barriers to avoid things like carrot root fly or cabbage white butterflies and their caterpillars. So yeah, again, think of what you do. There's a lot of information out there, and ask friends and relatives. I just wanted to show you potato planting, and I don't know if you have we got time for this. It's a little, maybe some of you want to plant potatoes. This is a film I did for Facebook last year when we couldn't go and see people. This is about planting potatoes. Right, so I hope you know exactly how to plant your potatoes. Right, okay, yeah, last year was a bit weird, so we had to try to put things up on our Facebook page, engaging people with growing. So ways of deterring alternatives to pesticides. You have to either smart anything, stop the slugs. I tend to plant quite a lot more extra plants, so I call them sacrificial plants that the slugs can eat. And then you have the plants you want in the middle. Yeah, there's a lot of different things you can do. Copper tapes, coffee granules, grit, etc. Of course, if you have a very good garden, you will have those ladybird caterpillars in there, and they will do the job for you. So for that reason, ditch your all pesticides, I would say, and get knowledgeable about how to grow your garden organically. So the responsible gardener uses peat-free compost. I shouldn't advertise, but there's a company called Melcourt, which have good compost. Make your own, of course. Check the source of where you buy your things from. Make sure that the bulbs haven't been dug up illegally. Again, check the source of materials. Where does the limestone come from? Be organic and don't disturb wildlife during nesting season. There are a few things to think about. So I'm not going to talk about the nectar borders. I'll just quickly go through that to give you an appetite for the next talk, which will be an end of March on the 25th. And in case you're about to plant, I'll give you a few good plants here. I won't say all the names, but basically think of planting different plants that are in flower throughout the year. So aubrecias will soon come out, honesty. Violets are already flowering in many places, and the lungwort, which I really love. Then summer flowers, and think of autumn flowers. So think of the year and see how you can have something in flower all year round. So what we all can do your wildlife gardening at home, possibly at work. Maybe you can influence your neighbors and create a little umbrella effect where you live, and keep learning. Importantly, appreciation of our countryside and wildlife does sound very young. So thank you very much, everybody, for listening. And I think now we can stop listening to me, and then you can ask questions. Thank you very much for being with me.